for giving me for the week off and coming back. Much appreciated. Yeah, okay. So let me just check in and see if we have last time we did kind of the tour de force of history, and it's been a week. So anything I left out that you're interested in, or questions you've got about Judaism that I could try to cover either this week or next? And interrupt me at any time. So what I wanted to start with today is theography. If that's okay, if you sort of read through the Torah, you end up with essentially a couple of different places that are like holy places, right? So in the beginning, you get nature and you get history, and there's this really lovely rabbinic read you've probably heard me say in church before, but I think it bears repeating. In Genesis chapter 1, with the beginning of the creation of the world as we know it, not necessarily from the very, very beginning, you end up with these series of days, right? And the first thing that happens is God separates light from darkness. So you have to imagine once upon a time they weren't separate. That's an interesting thing to try to do in your brain, right? So they used to somehow be combined, which makes no sense, but God separates them out so that there can be night and day, and there's an evening and a morning. And the second thing God does is separates the sky from the water. Again, imagine that the sky and water were one entity. This is an interesting thing, right? And then that's day 2. On the third day, there's a separation of ground from water and plants, and that's day 3. On day 1, there wasn't sun, moon, or stars. There's just light and dark. So on day 4, now there's the big light and the little lights and all the other little lights, and they're not called sun and moon because those are the names of foreign deities. So they're just big lights and little lights. On the 5th day, the sky and the sea get filled with living creatures, birds of the air and things that swim. And on the 6th day, the land gets filled with living creatures and human beings. So there's a little bit of a pattern, right? Day 1 creates the concept of light and dark. Day 4 fills it with the lights. Day 2 makes the concept of sky and sea. Day 5 fills the sky and sea with life. Day 3 creates the ground. Day 6 creates the living things on the ground. After every day, there's an evening and morning. And then you get to the 7th day, and you probably know what happens the 7th day. God rests. And guess what there's not on the 7th day? There's not an evening or a morning. So our rabbis are clever folks, and they pay careful attention, and they say that's because we're still living in the 7th day. It's still unfolding. So God's rest is still happening. And they're also really clever to say, well, look, when God separates light from day, really what God created was time. Because that's how you tell time. And before that, there wasn't an evening and morning, which is how we tell time. So the rabbis say, hey, like actually time is the first thing, and it's the middle thing. God makes the sun and the moon and stars to regulate time. And the last thing is all about God's rest. And where is it that God has chosen to rest? It's in time itself. So there's this rabbinic understanding that we have Sabbath. Sabbath means 7. It also means perfect, and it's Shabbat, right? That's the thing you do. And the Sabbath is when you enjoy God's presence in time itself. Not necessarily in geography, but in moments. So this is a really interesting concept theologically, that God is just full and saturated in time itself and active in history. It's pretty beautiful. It's pretty beautiful. And so I want to put that before you, that even though that's the first thing, that there's this garden and there's time, that still becomes really important. And we'll talk about this when we talk about rites of renewal, ways in which Jewish people are renewed ritually. There's this famous quip that more than the Jews have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews, which is all about not necessarily the synagogue. It's really the Sabbath happens some at the synagogue, but it really happens at your home. It happens in homes with a meal that is shared. And the prohibition against work is so that you can actually enjoy the fruits of the labor you've done and not be up scrambling doing dishes. You're prohibited from doing it so that you have to spend time with each other, coming back to time. It's pretty clever, actually, right? Because I sure love doing the dishes, so I don't have to spend time. Right? So this is like part of what it means. So there's one. The second piece of what we'd call theography, we get in the Exodus account with there's this tabernacle. It starts as the tabernacle, which is a tent. And remember last 2 weeks ago, I told you historically there's a big change in Judaism between the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then sort of the monarchy. According to the Torah, God doesn't live in a building built by human hands, but you can build a tent over the ark. And the ark, does anybody know what the ark represents, by the way, just out of curiosity? Where God is, and what's God doing on the ark? Well, it's interesting. There's supposed to be something called the mercy seat up there, but the ark is actually God's footstool. So God stands on top of the ark. And when you build a temple and when you build a tent and it has a ceiling, that tells you how big God is. So just keep in mind that the temple David built is not as high as our sanctuary. So there was some imagination, right, that God's kind of invisible body was like a giant, but not a super giant. I mean, just this is important to hear that there's evolution about embodiment and what divinity kind of does. Yes, sir.
Wasn't the 10 commandments in there?
The 10 words show up in there, and so does a jar of manna, and so does Aaron's staff, which buds, like it's dead and then it grows a new thing. And so that lives in there too. And remember, that goes around in the tabernacle for a long time, and it takes a tour. The tabernacle goes wherever the people go, right? God's moving with them. And then when they get established in the land, it goes from Shiloh to Dan to Bethel in a circuit as a reminder that God isn't just in one spot. When David builds the temple, now it lives in one spot. And in that spot, we still call the Holy of Holies. And nobody knows quite where that is. But if you've been to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, like most pious Jews don't want to walk around up there in case they step on it by accident, because it is a distinct spot. And just to let you know, the spot is supposed to be on this rock on which Abraham bound his son Yitzhak. So this is where the Akedah happened, and that this sort of rock either happened right there on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, or else that rock got drugged there. Either one, that's supposed to be sort of the paver for the Holy of Holies. Does it look different? Well, not presently. When we talk about Islam, it'll be interesting to know that rock got drugged down to Saudi Arabia, and that's the Kaaba now. So that's the holiest rock spot in Muslim geography. As I mentioned, though, the temple got this. So we had tents, tabernacle. By the way, do you know what we keep the reserved sacrament in sanctuary? It's in this little box, right? And do you know what that's called? It's not called the ambo. The ambo is the lectern. We don't use the word lectern because we can preach from the ambo. So there's the ambo. Some folks call it the ambry. It's actually called the tabernacle, right? It's the tabernacle because, hey, that's where we like reserve the sacrament, and that comes straight out of Jewish identity. If you're interested, an ambry is an arch at the back of a church when we had the Lord's table against the wall and the priest turns their back to mediate between you and between you and God. That happened before the 76 prayer book. There was always an arch over the altar, Lord's table. That arch is the ambry. We don't have an ambry at St. Thomas because our Lord's table's never been against the wall, and there's not an arch back there because we were built since 1976. So if you ever walk into a church and there's a back arch, it probably predates the new prayer book. just to give you an idea. And some of these altars are so big, they're made out of marble or whatever, that they couldn't move them. They just left them, and then they built another one, right? So, because the priest is supposed to face you now, right, instead of turning their back to you. Okay, so tabernacle. But since the destruction of the second temple in the year 70 by the Romans, now really the religious geography is the Torah itself. And if you've been to a synagogue, and we got the tour over here the other day, right? You can see here's the Torah scrolls, and they do tend to be like within like silver. I mean, our gospel covers brass. I mean, they're within precious metal, and a Torah scroll probably costs you about $100,000, like for a synagogue to buy, because it takes a rabbi an entire year to copy one out, and it's not on paper; it's on vellum, usually veal skin, like fine leather. And so this is like a true. I mean, the one over here at Congregation Har Shalom is like definitely locked, right? Because they have 2 or 3 of them in there. And it's not that God like lives in the page, but the study of the Torah has become the sacred geography. Still, you say every Passover next year in Jerusalem, like we're going to go to Jerusalem at some point in our life. This is the thing we want to do. But God's presence more so in the ark, which we don't have anymore. Of course, it's in a warehouse in Area 51, if you've seen Indiana Jones, right? Since we don't have that, where's the sacred geography? It's in the Torah. It's in the Torah. And this pretty universal. You still will find that depending on what kind of, it's not even what kind of sort of denomination, whether you're Orthodox or conservative, there still is like something important. If when it's time for you to be buried, there is a tradition to have soil from Israel interred in your grave. So Israel is still the promised land, and depending on what kind, again, it's what tradition you grew up in, you really are only supposed to, you may only be supposed to drink wine from the land. Boy, and that's come a long way, because Manischewitz, I just got to tell you, I'd rather have Franzia, and that's hard, like that's hard. So the Jewish wines Hebrew wines have really upped their game a little bit, but this is the case. It's not. I would say it's even more so if you're Orthodox, or what we might call ultra Orthodox. Wine on the table should be from Ha'eretz Yisrael, like it should be from the land of Israel, if you can do it. So there's a little bit of that, but again, just think more about the Torah itself than a place that you go. So it sort of does a little bit of both.
Manischewitz has a factory in the Holy Land.
I guess so. I mean, I have to tell you, I'm not super interested in Manischewitz. Okay, I'm hoping this will turn slides. The next thing I wanted to talk to you is totally changing gears. And that's about theodicy. So theodicy is this word that will show up in all the ones we look at, right? You recognize theo from God, and then the dicy is about justice. So it's about God's justice. And theodicy is only really a problem if there's like 3 tenets. If we presume that God is good, then there's a problem because there's evil in the world, right? If God's not good, no problem, right? Like if God's somewhat evil, then that explains it, right? God has to be powerful or there's no problem. So like, God could be really loving and sweet, but if not powerful, it explains why there's evil in the world. God can't do anything about it. And then evil has to be real. That might sound funny to you, but there are schools of thought that say evil's not real, it's illusory. So like what you think is tragic, it's in your thinking that it isn't really. So if you hold all 3 of these together and you look at suffering in the world, now we have to try to figure out why does that happen. If God's good and strong and suffering's real, how's that work? So, and this is interesting. I mentioned to you Maimonides, and there is a cool thing in rabbinic tradition that they'll give. I've mentioned this to you that they'll give notorious rabbis like I don't want to say pseudonyms, but they'll give them that's not the right word. They'll give them aliases. So Maimonides in the Jewish tradition is called the Rambam. The Rambam says evil's only apparent. It's not actually real. It just seems like it is. And to be honest, that may sound silly, but let's think through it just for a second, because I want to build a little bit of compassion for that point. Sometimes there'll be an earthquake in California. I used to live there, and that can seem really bad. Like, why does that happen? But from a geologic point of view, if an earthquake didn't happen, well, the world would just kind of blow up, right? I mean, that's a function of tectonic plates doing what they need to do so that there isn't so much pressure that the world kind of implodes. Now, I guess we could say God could have made a world without tectonic plates. But if you just think through this, I mean, are hurricanes evil? They're just probably really inconvenient. People suffer from them, but they were happening before they were people, right? So Rambam's not crazy. Some of the stuff that we think is bad is just bad for us, but not necessarily evil. I'm going to really push this one hard too. According to the, oh, sorry, please.
Isn't there a tendency you're talking about? You're trying to conflate bad with evil.
We do
They're
that a
not
lot.
the same thing.
We do it a lot. Thank you. We do it a lot. And one of the things, particularly, I'm glad we got a physician in the room. There's a kind of cell that grows really fast. Like, it is so efficient at growth. The problem is, like, cancer affects our other systems. So cancer is really good at what it does. It's really good at what it does. It's just like not good for the rest of us. Is cancer evil? Or is it just bad for us? I'm not going to resolve that question for you, but I do want to tell you a good piece of biblical theology. See, and this is true with the rabbis as well. There's a verb in the Hebrew Bible, create, bara, and the only entity that can do that is God. So sometimes we talk in church like we're going to be co-creators with God. That's a sweet idea. It's just not biblical at all. Only God can create in the Bible. God creates everything that is, and on day 7 says, it is tov ma'od. It is exceptionally good, including mosquitoes and naked mole rats, the ugliest creature that there is. I mean, God says that's exceptionally good. So again, the Rambam's he's actually taking that really seriously and saying, I think, which is a helpful reminder to us, that when things are inconvenient or bad or hurtful, it doesn't mean they're evil. Now, that said, there's evil in the world. And particularly in the Jewish tradition, there's a lot of recognition of evil. So what I was talking about just now, about cancer cells and tectonic plates, is what we tend to call natural evil. And really, evil is not a good word. Again, it's just inconvenient for people. Moral evil, right, is when another human being makes an intentional decision that is going to inflict suffering on not just somebody else on the planet or an animal. We all say that's real, right? That doesn't just seem apparent in light of the Holocaust. That seems real. And of course, evil can be self-inflicted as well. So it turns out that there's not a single Jewish response to this, nor is there a single Christian or Muslim response. There's not. There's not even a single Hindu response. I mean, to be honest, we have to cast the net wide because one explanation for what we perceive as either evil or inconvenience is not super satisfying. Just case in point. A lot of times you get what you pay for. You all believe that because you went to college. I feel really comfortable making that assertion. Now, we don't always think that, but a lot of the times it's the case, right? You get what you pay for. We're also aware sometimes you don't get what you pay for, right? And we get into a lot of trouble when we say, well, that bad thing happened to you, that's because you did something you shouldn't have.
They're just kind of.
Now, this is not unique to Christianity, what I'm going to say. I grew up with the mindset you do get what you pay for, which means when suffering happens, it could be because you've sinned, and this is God teaching you a lesson. So when you get a speeding ticket, it's not because you were speeding, it's because you did something wrong before that. I mean, nobody ever quite said it that way, but that's an internalized thing. What did I do to deserve this? You were going faster than the posted speed limit. That's what you did to deserve being pulled over. Well, why didn't they pull the other guy over? Because they didn't. But our brains don't like that. Our brains have evolved, truly, to come up with some coherent story, even if it's not true. So if you read the book of Proverbs, everything that happens to you is what you deserve. That's it. But when you read the book of Job, you get another view that says, but maybe not everything. And they don't just flatly disagree. There's tension. Because again, it's true that a lot of what comes our way, we invested in that. Just not all the time, right? So there's one view. Of course, there is a problem, and you will find this particularly in some of the wisdom literature. Hey, like and you'll find this in the Psalms too, right? Like, hey, God, I've been faithful. I do my duties. I fast on Yom Kippur. And then there's this other guy down the block who doesn't do any of that. And he seems like he's getting ahead, and I'm not. We'll find this in every religion. You'll find it too. Maybe you can finish the proverb. The parents eat sour grapes, and their children's teeth are set on edge. The parents eat sour grapes, but their children's teeth are set on edge. Thank you for that one.
So it's biblical epigenetics? Is that?
Well, again, we have to keep in mind, like, is that actually an apt description of life? Is it fair? Maybe not. But let me ask you, if you drink during pregnancy, are you going to get fetal alcohol syndrome, or is your baby going to get it? Your baby's going to get it. So you drink sour grapes and your child's brain is set on edge. There is truth to that claim. And sometimes when it feels like I'm suffering, maybe I didn't do anything wrong, but maybe my parents did. By the way, that's universally true in the room. They also did some things right that I'm not usually as aware of as the things they did wrong, right? But this is another one of the responses. Again, you'll find this right in the Torah, given the proverb we just quoted, right?
So how do you fix that?
Well, I don't know if it's a fixing. I mean, I think these have traction because they are sometimes true. What we struggle with is, when is it that and when is it the other thing? And by the way, that's just human beings struggle with that. So I'll tell you some of the similar things when we look at Christian theodicy and Muslim theodicy, right? This is just the human experience. And we don't have, I mean, again, like, is it fair that your baby is addicted to crack and you're not? Of course, it's not fair, but it happens, right? It happens, and it results in suffering. More for other people physically than for yourself. I mean, so there's the rabbis, they get this. And this is throughout the Hebrew Bible as well. Hey, maybe you've heard this one too. This is also a very Christian response. Suffering's just nonsense for now, but it'll make sense later. Because, God understands all this, and we just only see a little part. But if we saw the whole narrative, then it would make sense. Suffering results from human action, not God. It's not God out there saying, boy, Darlene, I didn't like the way she talked to her husband. I'll give her a cavity. That'll teach her a lesson. Right. But I don't think they were God given, right? I mean, that's the thing, right? Yeah, I mean, so sometimes, and look, I sort of grew up in a tradition that said, hey, if things don't make sense, it's because your understanding is limited. And anyway, your sense of justice is so bad, who are you to question God? So there's that answer, right? This doesn't make sense now. Maybe it will make sense later. Lots of people say, hey, when I die, the first thing I'm going to ask God is why this, as if there's going to be a coherent explanation. That's the assumption. Maybe there will be, I don't know, but that's assumed, right? And again, you see this in Jewish tradition too. And then another thing that is just maybe a helpful reminder is, particularly when we talk about this kind of evil, like the planet and earthquakes, is that's an anthropocentric point of view, and look, like God made other stuff than us. So we're not like the only thing God cares about. In fact, the book of Job does this for about 2 chapters, where God talks to Job and says, Job, like, you're just worried about yourself, but this is really interesting. I'd encourage you to read this if you don't believe me. There's like half a chapter where God talks about how stupid ostriches are. The ostrich is the stupidest animal in the world. They bury their head in the sand. They don't even feed their own babies, and I feed them. And you don't care crap about the ostrich, but I do. So you're worried about your problems. I'm worried about ostriches who are stupid. I mean, like, it's just an interesting response, right? So to the locus of where does God's care go? And it isn't just us. So we could say we hate mosquitoes. God should kill all the mosquitoes. But reminder, like, God made the mosquitoes and said that they're exceedingly good. Well, they're evil. They give me bites and they hurt and they spread disease. Okay, and God made them. So again, this is just a reminder that they're probably more inconvenient for the human experience than they are evil. Okay, I don't know if I want to go into too much from the Zohar. Remember, the Zohar is the mystical textbook, but I do want to say there's this really interesting bit. The 4th part is our response to evil is not to question why it is. Our response is to fix the world. So we could get all wound up in, why does God allow this? I mean, really, the Zohar says the reason it happens is because God's presence, remember, was withdrawing to make room for creation, and the vessels broke. So we have to put them back together. Now, if you're like me, you're wondering, like, why didn't God use stronger vessels? Like, why didn't God use unbreakable things? The book doesn't care about that question. What the book says is, it is our job to mend creation, and in somewhat doing, to mend God's will. So what we do on earth is actually just a representation of a deeper reality happening in the heavens. When we do acts of righteousness, we are mending God's spirit in the universe. Yeah, okay, I don't know if I want to talk about that other stuff. Now, a couple things happened with the destruction of the temple. Explanations for why would God allow God's house to be destroyed. So remember, the first time that happened was in the year 586 before the Common Era. Happened again in 70 of our Common Era. So it's happened twice. And that day, we'll talk about it later, it's called Tish B'Av. If you're in Jewish tradition, the temple was destroyed on exactly the same day, 644 years apart. Same day of the same month, Tish B'Av. And at the time, you can read this in books like Jeremiah and Isaiah. They're trying to come up with, like, how did that happen and what does it mean? So one meaning is, if God's house gets destroyed, it's because God's not powerful enough to stop other gods. So there's other gods out there that are more powerful than our gods, and essentially our God just died. But another one is, hey, we did not follow the Torah, so God abandoned us. God withdrew, and since God withdrew, now the temple was vulnerable. When God was present, it was invulnerable, but because of our actions, God withdrew. By the way, of course, another idea, right, is sure God's real, but then there's other gods and they have power, and that shows up in the Bible. If you read the book in 1 Samuel, the Philistines capture the ark. The priests drag it out when they shouldn't have, and they capture it and they put it in the temple to the pagan god Dagon, who apparently has a fish head, and they're really happy because they've sort of captured, like the shrine of God's presence, and they put it in their own temple. And then the next morning they wake up and Dagon is like broken into pieces, like the statue is all busted. So then they move it to another temple, and what do you know? Dagon loses again. Like in the minds of the book, God is wrestling with Dagon, and just God wins. Doesn't mean Dagon's not real, means Dagon's not as powerful. So they didn't actually subdue God. God allowed the ark to be taken away. I hope you hear the distinction. Yes, sir.
Could it be that this is simply the religion growing, other than, becoming almost sophisticated?
Yes, and then we come to this really big crisis. So the temple's one thing, and reminder, when there's no temple, this is when you start to study the Torah, which is really kind of what results in the synagogue, right? The synagogue system is a result of being dispersed. Judaism did okay with that. They even did okay with pogroms and ghettos. Like they did okay with that. The boilerplate moment is Hashoah, the Holocaust. Because the numbers and the scale is so just difficult to comprehend. And now what happens to your sophistication? Now I'm going to tell you some of the responses, and you're going to hear some Christian responses too, even if you don't agree with them. One is God did that, God allowed that to happen because Reform Judaism and Zionism were wrong expressions of our faith. Now, the only people who would say that would be Orthodox folks. You may say that's a weird thing. I remember reading on September 12th, 2001, this thing by Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, that God allowed those towers to be destroyed because of the NAACP, the ACLU, and like the United Negro College Fund, because they were liberal. America was liberal with our faith, so God didn't just allow it, God engineered it. Now, these are Christian folk who I vehemently disagree with, because what that says about God is not a God I would ever worship. I would just be afraid of that God, but I wouldn't give that God any worth or merit. But it helps them understand there's a reason for this, and we can do something about it, right? Wouldn't you love to know there's a reason and you can do something about it? For your health problems? I would. What's great, right, is when you reach this great age, right, where you walk into the doctor and they're like, well, you just have IBS. Okay, what can I do about it? See you next year. Why would I want to see you next year? Right? Like, welcome to above 40, right? So it'd be great if they said, wash yourself in a river 7 times and blow bubbles and you'll be fine. I mean, that would be great. So that's what Jerry Falwell did. That's what he said. If we didn't have this stuff, it'd all be fine. And that was one response. That wasn't in general the response. Another response is, hey, God's just not omnipotent. So God couldn't stop it. Again, that comes up here. It takes away this one right here. So then now it's not as big as a problem as he thought it was. The major response has been atheism. There just is no God. So either God died or God departed and didn't come back. Because who would take chosen people and allow 1 million children to be incinerated and gassed? This is a hard question. And withdrawal is another one. And there's another interesting, and these aren't the only ones. There's actually a whole book on this by a pretty famous rabbi who was at Emory when I was there, who basically said, well, actually, it's because God's an abusing parent. So God will make up with us and whatever, and then God will get mad and abuse us. It was a challenging book to read. It was really challenging. It's called Facing the Abusing God, if you want to read it. And what do you know? It's written in 4 columns on each page, which is the like, as I mentioned, like the historic way to do Talmud Torah. So this is a problem, and the atheistic problem is a real issue that Judaism is trying to deal with, again, because we haven't had a Christian Holocaust. We just haven't, right? But a Jewish Holocaust is a real thing, and so probably you've heard me say that probably more than 95% of Jewish people are functionally atheistic. And part of what happened after World War II is they said, you were going to try to take our Judaism away from us, so we're going to prove you wrong, and we're going to double down and do it ritually. But theologically, what happened was TBD. So there's a difference between Jewish identity, right, and Jewish belief. I hope that makes sense what I'm saying. To be determined. Yeah. Yeah, and now what's happening is post-Holocaust, kids, so people in the Holocaust generation became very committed to preserving this way of life without necessarily a strong, I'm speaking in very blanket terms, so I don't want to overdo this, right? I know I may be overdoing it, but then see, their kids grew up doing those rituals without necessarily a faith component, and the question is, why are we doing this? Yes, sir.
One of the things that's helped me to kind of deal with that concept is there's a difference between faith and belief, and we often conflate them,
Yeah.
especially in English.
Yeah, that is super helpful, and a way of life versus tenets of doctrine, right? And Judaism is more of an identity and way of life than it is tenets of doctrine, and that's whether you're, with the exception of being Orthodox. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, it's an identity with the Jewish people.
Mhm.
That's what makes a Jew in many people's minds.
Thank you. Right, and sometimes that's hard for us because depending on what kind of Christian tradition you grew up in, beliefs were like number one thing, or like doctrines were top, instead of like, well, why would you do these practices if you didn't have the right doctrines to support them? This is not the way this gets mapped out for most of our Jewish siblings.
I have a question.
Please.
Okay, you were talking earlier about how the tabernacle or the ark was under a tent at one point.
Yeah.
Or that, and of course, we have a church building. And it's nice for us because we're inside out of the elements, but why aren't we roofless? Like, wouldn't that be ideal? I mean, God is limitless and he doesn't need a roof. You know what I'm saying? It's
Yeah.
like-
Right. Well, there's not really an easy answer to that. I mean, there are Christian traditions, like particularly the Celtic monastic tradition, that really prided themselves on being outside a lot.
Yeah.
And there's like, if you look in the Book of Saints in the Episcopal Church, holy men, holy women, there's somebody in there called John Muir, which maybe you've heard of, right? And he's a big challenge to gathering inside at the exclusion of the outdoors. And when you have a corporate gathering that's multi-age, boy, it's real convenient to be inside.
No, yeah, it's nice.
And of course, the other thing it represents, which isn't necessarily sinister, is to be mindful of, right? Buildings do give you social control.
Yeah.
In strong read, David built the temple as social control. I mentioned that to you 2 weeks ago. The temple was smaller than his personal home that was attached to the temple. Maybe he was well-intentioned, and still,
Yeah,
that's pretty convenient.
yeah.
So I don't have a great answer for you. I mean, honestly, I think if we're mindful that in some ways we need both, it's good. I mean, we need places where we can gather that are ADA accessible and have restaurants. Like, that's really important.
Yeah.
And look, an outdoor church in Houston's a disaster. Like, it's just awful. You know, 6 months of the year, it's fine, but then there's the, you know, like, it would be terrible. Right? Like, if it weren't for air conditioning, we wouldn't live here. I don't think we would. And that it's hard enough living here with it, right? So,
Right.
but I mean, you raise a fine point, right? And there is this generational movement, and this happens, I think, generationally, that say, well, you know, I'm spiritual and not religious, and I find God outdoors, so therefore I don't want to come inside. Well, y'all find God outdoors too. The point of coming inside is so that we can have, like, well, convenience and fellowship, right? I mean, like, because it's hard to have that structured outdoors when weather's inclement or people have mobility challenges, right? Like, when you sort of make a subset, everybody kind of like does what you do, which is again, it's convenient, but it's not really community. It's kind of like worshiping yourself. It's like a really good thing to be with people who don't think like you. I think so.
I think, I don't know how the rest of you feel, but I'm an outdoorsy person. I was long distance cyclist and a hiker and all that. There was a sensation about doing that was way above and beyond being inside of it. And you do outdoor stuff.
Most of my profound religious experiences are not in church,
So they're not in church.
but I don't think that's true for you either. When my baby was born, well, I wasn't in church. That was in a terrible, hospitals are terrible places. I'm sorry, they're awful. But that was a profound religious experience, no? It was profound. And I don't think I wanted my wife to do that in a sanctuary. That just would have been weird, right? So it's okay to say this, like, let's just be honest, right? And a lot of times we say, well, the church is God's house. I mean, but it isn't. It isn't. It's a place that we hopefully, it represents a way that we relate to God and each other, and we do want to set it apart. I can tell you on this end, people don't. I'm worried what your homes look like based on the way people treat this place. We just, you know, but we use this language sometimes, and we forget it's a constant conversation. You know, if you're Muslim, Muslims are a lot better at saying outside's the place to be. Why do they have mosques? It's so you can pray together once a week. It turns out you can go multiple times a day. But, you know, the biggest shrine in Islam is outdoor. It's not climate controlled. And you don't, it's not just a nice thing. Like, you have to go there. Once in your life, you got to go. We don't have that equivalent. There's nowhere in Christianity you have to go before you die. And I would tell you in Judaism, it's somewhere in between the two. You don't ever have to go to Israel, but it would be nice if you went. I want to talk about eschatology. So eschatology means words about the end, right? Like, how does this all end up? And there's a lot of different ways to hear this. And rather than talking about everything I have here word for word, I'm just going to tell you that probably 99.9999% of Jewish people don't believe in hell, period, dot. Do not. What about for Hitler? Still not. So what did they say? What happens if you're bad? You just cease to exist. This life is all you get, you're done. In fact, most Jewish people would tell you what happens if you're really good. When you die, you cease to exist. You may find that gloomy. They don't find that gloomy at all. Like, this is the life you get. Lean into it, enjoy it, do what you can, repair the world, right? Now, there is a concept of afterlife in a number of Jewish traditions. It's not super well defined, and it doesn't have like harps and angels on clouds. Like, that's a thing that came into the Christian tradition pretty late as well, that whole angel harp thing. We'll talk about that when we get to Christianity. So just so you know, and the rabbi said this very clearly this January when we visited Har Shalom. He said, what kind of just God would punish people infinitely for a thing they did that was temporal? Just think through that for a second. No matter how bad of a villain you are on earth, your acts of villainy have a term limit. They don't live forever. So why would God punish you forever for something you did that doesn't last forever?
The repercussions could last, well, I don't know, forever, maybe, but at least for a while.
So you get punished for a while, but not forever.
Well,
By the way, this is why Christians have been in purgatory, because that makes more logical sense. That you pay for it and then you leave. It's actually pretty compassionate, the idea of purgatory. But just so you hear, most Jewish folks know. Now, if there is a hell, and again, that's a very small minority of Jewish people have that idea. Who goes there? Haman and Hitler. I mean, it's like a handful of folks that are just egregious folk. But like I say, that doesn't have traction in most expressions of Judaism. Sure enough, there is messianism. And sometimes we think, oh, Jewish people are waiting for the next Messiah. Well, not exactly. It's not like people are counting down the days, right, and waiting for this to happen. That's a Christian warp of what it means to be Jewish. But sure enough, here's the idea that and this is a very minority of messianic expectation, that there will be a Messiah who essentially will restore the boundaries of Israel. And if you're like this kind of ultra Zionist will also rebuild the Jewish temple, or will bring it down from heaven, one or the other. Most Jewish people aren't waiting for this. I just want you to know. They're not like eager, like life goes on, here's what we're doing. So I just want to caution you against thinking like, Jewish people are reading the newspaper and the Torah waiting for like the right Messiah who's going to like deliver them from all their enemies. That's just not it. Like we've got a way of life. Here's what we do. There is some sort of understanding, right, that there's not like a Jewish book of Revelation, right? So there's not like, oh, I can't wait till the earth is gone. Actually, like Judaism's very embodied. It's so embodied that when you die, you've got 24 hours to get in the ground. We don't have that urgency, right? We just don't have that. So, again, you'll find minority views all over the place. And maybe the thing to say about messianism is there have been times in which there was some popular expectation for a messianic figure to restore liberation and freedom and peace. And that's natural to expect when you're a persecuted group of people. It was happening around the time of Jesus. There were like false messiahs, is what we would call these folks, who essentially, and they got put down real harsh, by the way. Judas the Galilean is one of those. He's mentioned in the New Testament as well. There was a major revolt that happened in 132 under this guy called Simon Bar Kokhba, and people thought he was going to be the Messiah. Actually, initially, they obliterated a Roman legion. So they seemed like this was going to be really good until Rome brought like 5, and then it wasn't so good. So he's a false Messiah because he didn't work. I don't know if that makes sense. But a lot of messianic expectation. And there's been some really interesting stories. Like this guy here, Sabbatai Tzvi, during the reign of the Ottoman Turks, like thought he was the Messiah. There was a big following of the guy. He even said he was. And then he converted to Islam. And that really confused folks. But, when you want to believe something, you'll find a way to keep it true. So he did that in order to do some divine function temporarily. He's going to come back and fix it. I mean, this is stuff. And look, this happens in Christianity too. And we're talking about minorities, not majority, to be really clear. So you'll find all kind of crazy stuff, but it's usually pretty minority. Keep in mind, maybe this was the other class I told you about this. Immortality of the soul is not an idea in the Hebrew Bible anywhere. You won't find it anywhere. If you read the Hebrew Bible, there's a few key words that hopefully your translation has for you. Sheol, or the pit. And it'll show up with a capital P. And this one you'll see all throughout Job. And apparently, ancient Hebrew religion, when you die, you go to the underworld, which is the place of the dead. Sheol and the pit. You can read Job talk about this. Who goes there? Everybody. Rich people, poor people, influential people, peons, good people, bad people. You just go there. What's it like? It's dark. It's just real dark and it's kind of underground. Can you visit the underworld? No. Samuel, actually, in the book of Samuel, King Saul pulls Samuel's dead spirit out of the grave. Like, who knows how that happens, but it happens in the story. Samuel's essence comes up from Sheol, and he's not happy about that, right? Like, he's really upset that a witch has summoned him from the place of the dead, because that's where he belongs, not in the place of the living. So immortality of the soul enters the Jewish imagination maybe after encountering Zoroastrianism, more likely when encountering some aspects of Greek philosophy. So it's not an indigenous Hebrew idea. I don't know if that makes sense, what I'm saying.
But do they believe that now?
Yes and no.
Because I have a Jewish friend, I thought I understood that the reason they buried so quickly, no embalming, no defiling of the body or changing anything, is because that's the body that they believe when they meet God eventually, eternally, that they'll inhabit. Even though I'm not sure how you reconcile that when we know that the body deteriorates.
Right.
If you dig up your dad, it's not going to be your dad.
It's connected with where your spirit is at the time of burial. And let's be honest, as we mentioned, there's tradition and then there's theology. We all do a lot of traditions that we have no idea how they started or what they mean, but darn it, you better do them. I'm not saying that's the case with burial. So yes, there is, it's pretty widespread that there will be something later, but not torture, not punishment. And what it's like, who knows? And the reason there's a little bit of a hands-off approach, like I say, is because historically, this is not an indigenous Hebrew idea. That's changed through syncretism, through encountering other ways of life. So what I want to try to say, maybe more than anything, is the church that raised me was very fixated on what happens when you die. Like, the whole point of life is what happens in your afterlife. Judaism does not weight it that way, if that makes sense. This life is real important. And you did say something that I really appreciated. Judaism is very embodied. Your body matters. Earliest ideas of the resurrection in the New Testament, if you read 1 Thessalonians, which is the earliest book we have, is that the dead are raised and they go up in the sky with their body. Which one? You're probably thinking, not this one, but take a different one. But that was the view. Your body, not somebody else's. You don't get Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie. You get you, and that's kind of your vessel. Yeah. So we've evolved that understanding Christianity as well. Okay, maybe that was not the most exciting presentation about eschatology, but hopefully it was a broad enough brush view. As I mentioned, you'll talk to 5 Jewish people and they'll tell you 5 different things, but that's not different from talking to 5 Christian people either. Okay, I want to talk about rites. So rites or rituals. And I remember when we did the framing, there's essentially two kinds of rites. Rites of renewal. Those are the ones you do over and over who remind you of who you are. We do the Eucharist every week, right? Rites of passage, you do a limited number of times, preferably once, right? Like in general, marriage is a rite of passage. And by the way, it's okay in some ways. You can say, well, I got divorced and I got remarried and I did that 3 times. So that was more of a rite of renewal. Well, it wasn't. The first time you get married, you have passed identity-wise. You passed from being singular to now you get to be husband or wife, and that's an identity change. Well, once I got divorced, I wasn't a husband or wife anymore. In some senses, no. And in other senses, when you adopt that vocabulary, your identity changed. If you had a child, you had a rite of passage because now you're a parent. if your child dies, does that undo the fact that you changed identity by having a child? I don't think so. I hope that makes sense, right? So there's again, we have life events that are rights, and what do you know, like those get codified. Like marriage is a thing in every tradition. Like there's a marriage rite. But then there's also rituals, like for us, baptism and Eucharist and confirmation and ordination and reconciliation and anointing with oil. These are our rites. So a little bit different set for Jewish folk. And look, there's two ways to look at these. The rites are for us. The reason we do these rituals is so that we can remember who we are, so that we have a clearly defined time like, oh, I was a child and now I did that right and now I'm an adult. There aren't very many of those rites, by the way, and a lot of sociologists are concerned about that. How do you know when you become an adult today? Just to give you an example. Well, 50 years ago, you knew you were an adult when you graduated high school. Yeah, that's not working anymore, is it? So then it became when you graduated college. But look, if you know the market today, you're going to be going to grad school. So is that when you're an adult? We know a lot of people who are, what do you call that, failure to launch, right? Failure to launch. So adulthood's in question, right? Oh, it's when you get married. Yeah, right. We don't have a good sense of when do you get there. We don't. Now, if you're Jewish, you do.
Yeah.
You have a good sense. You have a bar mitzvah done. How old are you?
Well,
13 if you're a boy. If you're a girl, you're 12. Why? Because girls mature faster than boys, and we all know it. It's institutionalized that way. The 13-year-old an adult? Yeah, so anyway, rights are for us, or, hey, rights are for God. And by the way, I think we often wrap these up. I don't know that it's either or. Do we confess our sins because we need to do that? Or do we do it because God needs us to do it?
That's a good question.
I agree. It's a great question. That's why I'm a priest. And I'm the kind of priest that says God doesn't need it, we need it, which is why we better do it. But I tell you, God doesn't need it, but we sure do. Maybe that makes me a bad priest, but like, I didn't think God needs us to do much. I think the stuff we do is because we need to do it.
But maybe he wants it.
And why does God want it? Because God knows it's good for us, right? So this is a great conversation, right? Not needed, but not wanted because God wants to have it, but God wants us to have the release. Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of priest I am. But I have colleagues who will say, no, God requires that, and you can't be forgiven unless you do it. And I don't want to say they're wrong. I'm just going to say that's not me. And then this is true in Judaism too. It's not, again, I'm just talking as a human being. We come out on different sides differently on this, right? Why are rights for us? Well, because God's utterly transcendent. Maybe not. God might actually be embodied too, right? But so we do these things for us, and sometimes when you look at rights being for us, you get these weird cultural anthropologists who talk about things like sympathetic magic. Just to give you an example of that, you know, we prune bushes to make them like blossom, right? So a cultural anthropologist will say that's where circumcision came from. They thought if you prune a bush, it makes the bush more fertile. So we want to ensure fertility. That's why we're going to do this. No Jewish person accepts that. I don't accept that. That's real weird. And other things you'll hear, like the Jewish prohibition of pork. If you don't know this, you can't have pork products, period, dot. And you'll have cultural anthropologists who will say, well, that's because in the ancient world, people didn't know that, you know, if you undercooked pork, that you would get this disease called trichinosis. So it's just better for you not to eat it. And that's silly, right? I don't know if you know this. Almonds are inherently poisonous. Like they're full of arsenic and they'll kill you. And people figured out that we can train the almond not to have so much arsenic in it. How'd they do it? A lot of people died. But we sure figured it out. So if we could figure out an almond to not be poisonous, surely we can figure out you cook the pork a little bit longer. I mean, you know, like it becomes a little silly when we say, oh, it's because it's meeting some public health concern only. Again, no Jewish person would accept that we do this kosher system because it meets public health concern. You can cook the pork longer. It's safe. Why don't you eat pork? Because God told you not to eat the pork. That's it.
Or ritual washing.
Ritual washing. How effective is it against germ fighting? You know, this is my great opportunity to be an Episcopalian. There's this great idea that we get these little cups of juice. We take the Lord's Supper with these little cups of juice, and that's so much safer than drinking port wine out of a cup because you get your own cup, right? One of these, wow, there went that, right? So, you know, look, this is where we live in rights. They're not always logical. They're not always logical, but they're meant to do something for us, right? Reminder, how can rights be for God? Well, particularly, right, like if you're thinking about from the Zohar and the Kabbalistic tradition, God needs us to fix, God's presence got broke up and God needs us to fix it. That's tikkun olam. It's not like it's a sweet thing for you to do. It's your duty to fix God. Not all Jewish people believe that, right? But that becomes part of it.
I have a question regarding eating.
Please.
As a Roman Catholic, I was raised as a Roman Catholic, and we never ate meat on Friday.
Yes, that happened in the 1300s when the Pope wanted to support the local fishing industry. So it had nothing to do with religion. This is true, documentarily. Had zero to do with it, zero. And it happened it happened episodically. Like there was, the fisher folk were not doing well. And hey, Pope was looking out for his people, right? So, hey, if you can't eat meat, you got to buy fish. I've solved a problem. But then when people forgot that that was a short-term solution, right, and institutionalized it, well, why can't I have meat on Fridays during Lent? Well, because there's something wrong with meat. Well, then don't eat it the rest of Lent. And so what happened is there's an episode, we forgot why that happened and we institutionalized it. And that isn't just a Roman thing. We all do that stuff. We all forget why we started doing a thing, but you better darn well do it. Because we've been doing it like this for as long as I can remember, which is like 4 years. I mean, the earlier tradition is you only eat meat, period, if you work, like if you do labor. That's the earlier Christian tradition. Comes out of the monasteries. So if you were a scribe, you didn't eat meat ever. You didn't eat it. We have a different tradition in this country that you eat meat 3 times a day. You may not do that, but that's pretty traditional in this country. That's not traditional in Europe. That's an American development. And sometimes we just don't realize that the rest of the world doesn't eat like we do. They can't, they don't have the landmass we have. Okay, so what are rites of passage? Well, being born. By the way, these are pretty universally the case. These are just life events, right? Being born and being circumcised. And, you know, this happens on the 8th day, if you're a Jewish male, and it may not happen in a synagogue, but it's probably happening at your home, not the hospital. And there's going to be family and friends there for it. In our kind of way of life here, probably the doctor did that for your kid, right? And you probably weren't there, and I sure wouldn't want to be there. But you know, this is like a major. If without circumcision, you're not really part of the covenant as a male. Who does it? Not a doctor, but somebody called a mohel. They may or may not be a rabbi. Usually they're not. This is just kind of what they do. Is they're kind of Jewish community support. They do the circumcision, and there's a rabbi on hand who does some prayers and thanksgivings and celebrations, and it's a community event.
It's interesting that I've known a couple of physicians that are mohels. They're not allowed to do circumcisions on non-Jewish people. So once they got approved to be a mohel,
Then they couldn't do it anymore.
they couldn't do it at the hospital. They had to do it with their traditional thing.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah. By the way, I want to make sure you know that Semitic peoples practice circumcision almost ubiquitously. So sometimes you can read the scriptures and think like, oh, it's just Hebrew people doing it. Nope, Egyptian people were doing it too. And so were Moabites and Edomites and people in Assyria. Who wasn't doing it were Greek folk. And if you go visit the Parthenon, you'll see when Hercules fights the Egyptians, they look different from Hercules because the Egyptians were doing that.
I remember hearing something years ago when I was in a more fundamentalist community about the reason for the circumcision on the 8th day is that the something in the blood contributed to the coagulation more just on that 8th day after birth. Was there any truth to that? or
That's
do you
the
know?
same thing about trichinosis and
That's
why you
exactly
don't
what-
cook pork,
yeah,
right? I mean, it's coming up with a logical reason for a tradition that may or may not have anything to do with logic.
Right.
I can't tell you what happens on the 8th day, but it sure does. So you don't miss the 8th day.
I think if there's health problems with the baby, then that
They can
they
postpone.
can postpone,
Mm,
which
yeah.
actually some period of time after birth makes sense from a practical point of view.
And every religion, including our own, we make allowances for when rites work and when they don't work. Right? And like I was telling the vestry the story the other day, I went to see a lady in the hospital and I asked if she wanted to have communion and she said, I can't have it because I can't kneel. Because she'd never been told that like that's not required.
No.
It was kind of a lovely moment as a priest to be able to say, it's gonna be all right. It's going to be okay to give this to you in the bed. And it was almost a breakdown, like it was almost a spiritual breakdown to receive this thing she really wanted because she wasn't sure she was fit to receive it in the state she was in. So we do that. By the way, if you're Muslim and you're pregnant, you don't fast during Ramadan. If you're Muslim and you're in the Olympics, you don't fast during Ramadan, but you do make up for it when you can. So you make up for it when you can, right? You name your child on the Sabbath, the closest Sabbath after the birth traditionally. So if you had the kid on Thursday, come up with the name tomorrow. If you have the kid on the Sabbath, you get an extra week. Sometimes you can wait to name the male child for the circumcision, but usually girl kids get named at the closest Sabbath. A lot of our Jewish brothers and sisters tend to have two names in this country. In Israel, you probably just have one. You have like your given name and you have your Hebrew name or your Jewish name. My brother got a name when he converted that I think they use in his household, but my mom won't call him. I won't either. All right. Yeah. So as I mentioned, you enter adulthood if you're a girl at the age of 12, your bat mitzvah at the age of 13 if you're a boy. Now, different traditions do this a little bit different. When I say traditions, I mean Orthodox, conservative, reform, but not necessarily even that. Just in different communities, what's expected of you can be very different. Usually what's going to happen is you're going to go to Hebrew school for several months leading up to so that you can learn how to read an assigned portion of the Torah. So you may not actually be literate in Hebrew, but you know how to read this part. If this makes sense. Hopefully you're literate. Hopefully you're literate.
Who chooses the portion?
Usually the rabbi at the local place you're at, or it's set already. You know, we have the Revised Common Lectionary, and there's an equivalent, and you find it in the Siddur. That's not what it's called. It's Parshat, I think, is what it's called. The Parshat is the assigned reading for the day, so it's in conversation with that. When you hear read, sometimes you might read it. A lot of our Jewish brothers and sisters are expected to chant it. So it depends where you live, whether you'll be reading or chanting. You'll definitely be reading it in Hebrew, though. You won't be reading it in English. A couple other things that happen depending on where you are. Well, as I told you, you don't touch the scroll, right? You use a pointer called the yod. So they're going to use the yod. They may have something called tefillin on them. I'll show you that too. That's like a little rolled up portion of the Torah that they put in a box and is tied to their head. Phylacteries is, I think, the Greek word of tefillin, and wrapped around their arms too. This comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6 about, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You love the Lord God with all your heart, mind, soul, and spirit, and you'll write these words above your door. And you'll write them, you'll bind them on your head. You'll tell them to your kids before you go day and night. So it comes from that tradition that they'll literally bind them on their head when they read the Torah for the first time. Again, that's at 13. There are places that they don't tell you what you're reading in advance, so you better know how to read. That's less standard. And surely when you learn chant, it's not like you just make it up however you want. There's a chant tradition just like we have, right? A chant tradition about how when you lilt and when you go down and how you pause. Bat mitzvahs, of course, are the equivalent for girls, but they don't happen in every form of Judaism, right? So some Orthodox communities do and very few do. It's really more conservative and reform that allow for bat mitzvahs, because traditionally, and you've seen this probably if you've seen Yentl, or which I don't recommend, and Fiddler on the Roof, Torah studies for men. So why would you teach a woman to read the Torah if she's not allowed to read the Torah? So bat mitzvah is more of a, honestly, it's really more of a modern thing.
Well, the bat mitzvah too, is they actually lead
The congregation and
the
the king.
congregation and the service, and the ultra orthodox don't let women lead the
Right.
congregation.
So that's another reason you don't get one. And what happens at these often is that your family gives you gifts that are like, we would consider excessive, because this is your adulthood dowry, essentially, even if you're male. Like you might walk away from a bar mitzvah with $100,000 in the bank. But that may be all you're getting, right? Just to be really clear. Welcome to adulthood. Here's what you need. Now don't ask for a thing again. It's not that hard, but like again, it's not like you're 16 where you just get a nice party. Like you're walking with a bank account here. I think I have a picture. Yeah, and here you go, carrying the Torah scrolls. Here's a kid reading it. I'll just talk about marriage really briefly, and then we've talked a little bit about death actually already. Let me do death first. So you got 24 hours to get in the ground, and the tradition is you don't go to the mortuary, you don't go to the place where other dead people are. So as a hospital chaplain, when a Jewish patient died, we didn't move them out of the room. And the mortician, basically, the Jewish mortician is like on page, speed dial, etc., because the hospital doesn't like a dead body laying in a room. Right, they want to clean the room and give it to somebody else. So essentially, they got 2 hours to get that body out, and prepare for it, and do the funeral, right? And it would be like egregious to take a Jewish corpse and put it in the temporary morgue of the hospital. That would be like awful. I don't even know what the right comparison is. It's not a thing, like there'd probably be lawsuits because that's like a total violation of like what it means to do the right thing.
Do they believe in cremation?
By and large, so some people are doing it, and that's a new thing.
Okay.
It's a physical burial. It's a physical bodily burial by and large. As I mentioned, if you can, there's a lot of folks will try to put soil from Israel in the coffin or directly on the grave, like we'll import it. This is a thing. And you probably also know that Jewish people, unlike us, really know how to do grief seriously, because you get a week called sitting Shiva or sitting Shiva, where you don't do anything. And it's the community's job to take care of you. If they come and they bring you meals, and it's not like, hey, do you want a meal? It's you're not doing anything for a week. So this is just interesting to think. You don't get a day, you don't get like a lunch, you get a meal, and people come visit with you, and it's just intentional grieving. And then you get up and you wash your hair and you put on new clothes and you live your life. So it's a discrete time, it's dedicated, and then when it's over, you're allowed to still be sad and all that, but then you go live your life. It's really interesting, right? And again, the community really turns out, and they don't ask if they can, they do, and you take it. It's pretty sweet, actually. It's pretty sweet. Yeah. Marriage, I just talked about. Anybody been to a Jewish wedding?
No.
I'm just going to tell you, they know how to do these so much better than we do. Oh my gosh, Jewish weddings are like fun, and they're symbolic, and they're just really neat. And so let me tell you about a Jewish wedding. It still happens today, particularly if you're even in the conservative, you may do this, especially in Orthodox. What happens is all of the men do a contract first. They essentially sign a marital contract downstairs or in the adjacent room, And that's like the important part. And then what would happen is the groom will wrap the bride in a veil as a symbol that he is like going to protect her, and then potentially unwrap her. And then they'll go in, usually to a synagogue, but sometimes outside. And you usually know it's a Jewish wedding outside when you see one of these, which is called a chuppah. It should be made from, it depends what kind of, depends. If you're Orthodox, that should be made of natural materials. It should be wood. There should be maybe some flowers or garlands. I've seen mechanized, I've seen like industrial produced ones too. So it depends where you are. You go in there, and the interesting thing that happens is you've selected 7 members of your family who are going to give you a blessing. And it's not one they make up, like this is scripted. And the first thing that will happen, one of the first things that will happen is that the rabbi will bless wine, just like you do on the Sabbath, right? Blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, for creating the fruit of the vine. And then every time, because wine is a symbol for joy, still, every time somebody gives you a blessing, the couple will drink from the wine. Not a glass, it's like a drink, a sip of wine, right? And that's really sweet, isn't it? Like, I wanted 7 people to bless me when I got, like that's sweet. And having this symbol of wine, right? Now, you don't have to necessarily have it. Like if you've got alcohol abuse in your past, like that's not required that you do that, right? But the symbol of joy at marriage is really, really sweet, right? You do exchange some vows, and then there's like a really big party afterward. If you're Orthodox, that party's divided. Men dance with men, women dance with women, and they're not supposed to commingle or see that. If you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, like often the groom goes up in a chair, right? And they kind of carry the chair around as a way of like really just trying to celebrate and hopefully make the groom very happy. Like these are extravagant affairs. Like, I mean, really, a Jewish wedding's expensive. Like Christian weddings are expensive, and then there's like the Jewish wedding. Like it's a really kind of big affair to go to. I'm not really sure what else to say about it.
Well, you forgot the end of the ceremony of the Jewish wedding after they finish with the glass.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so you probably know this, right? I've actually tried to push this on Christian folk too. I'll tell you why, not in an appropriate way. They're under the chuppah, and when they're all kind of done, you probably know that they crush the glass. They put a wine glass down. And a lot of Jewish people will tell you it's a reminder that things like the temple fell and the temple broke and things break. And like a really common thing is, right, that the rabbi will say when things break in your relationship, the sort of the prayer and the blessing is that you can put them back together. So there's a recognition that brokenness happens in marriage and that it's fixable. And I've run into a few friends who do this. There are places you can send that glass, like you intentionally tie up the shards in a handkerchief and you send it to them, and they make a functional piece of art for your home from that piece of glass. Often it's a mezuzah, right, which holds the Torah scroll, and you might put that outside of your bedroom as a reminder. Things break and they can be mended, and broken things can be turned beautiful.
That's a good idea. We should
Oh,
all.
So, right, we always run the danger between respect and appropriation. And I'll tell you, like, I fall on one side than the other. I'm not trying to make it a Christian thing. I just think it's a cool idea. Like, I think it's really beautiful, and I think it applies.
Well, the fun thing at the end too is once the glass breaks, everybody screams Mazel
Mazel
Tov,
tov, yeah.
and it's applause, and it's just like, whoa.
Then it's a party.
Let the party begin.
It's a pretty raucous party.
Yeah.
I've been to one.
Yeah, they're super fun. Hey, by the way, like I've even told people here who want to do their vow renewal, if you want to break a glass, I know where to send it. And no, I mean it, I do. I know where to send it, right? Like I almost had a couple do it. Like, your 50th anniversary, that broke a bunch of times. Unless I'm wrong. I mean, I could be the anomaly. In the 19 and a half years, it's broken a few times, right? And we put it back together and it looks different. And I don't mind how it looks different, like that's just really thoughtful. I think that is, does God need us to do that? This comes back to this, right? Comes back to this. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I went over time already. So next time we'll talk about some rites of renewal, seasons, weekly rhythms. You, by the way, you don't have to applaud.
They're doing that for us.
Oh, you're doing it for yourself, okay.